The morning sun bled across the horizon like molten gold, glinting off the polished helmets of the soldiers assembled on the parade ground. Rows of men and women in crisp uniforms stood shoulder to shoulder, boots aligned in razor-straight lines. The air smelled faintly of sweat, leather, and the faint oil of freshly cleaned rifles. It was inspection day a day, every soldier both dreaded and anticipated with nerves knotted tight in their stomachs. At the center of the field, where the concrete gave way to flagpoles and trimmed grass, General Arthur Whitaker approached. His reputation preceded him. Whitaker was a man built of stone, a soldier who had risen through the ranks during the hardest campaigns of the last 3 decades. His hair was silver now, but his posture remained ramrod straight, his stride commanding, his very presence demanding. Obedience. Stories about him traveled faster than orders. Recruits whispered about his unshakable discipline, his ruthless punishments, and his ability to notice the smallest flaw from 30 paces away. This morning, though, there was something different in his eyes. Company. Stand to attention, bellowed Colonel Sanders, his voice echoing like thunder across the grounds. The soldiers snapped into place, their spines rigid, arms stiff at their sides. Silence followed. Only the flutter of the American flag above broke the stillness. Whitaker walked slowly down the first row, his boots clicking against the concrete with measured precision. He inspected each soldier with the sharpness of a hawk. A speck of dust on a belt buckle, a strand of hair out of place, the faintest hesitation in stance, nothing escaped his gaze. Soldiers held their breath as he passed. And then, without warning, it happened. Whitaker stopped abruptly in the center of the formation. His eyes narrowed, and he barked a command sharp, clear, and utterly foreign. Riggs formation. The words snapped like a whip in the air. A ripple of confusion moved through the ranks. No one stirred. Not a single boot shifted. The soldiers had been drilled endlessly, their lives carved into routine. Attention. Parade rest. Forward march. About face. The list of commands was engraved into their bones, each one carrying exact and immediate response. But Riggs formation? No manual contained such an order. The silence thickened. The officers glanced at one another, their lips tightening. Colonel Sanders blinked, as if he, too, had misheard. Whitaker's jaw clenched. His voice rose. Riggs formation. This time the words cracked across the yard like gunfire. Still, the soldiers froze. A bead of sweat trickled down the temple of one young private, but he dared not move. Disobedience could mean humiliation, discipline, or worse. The general's eyes flicked across the rigid formation. He could see it, the fear, the uncertainty, the silent desperation as each soldier silently asked, "What does he want from us?" Lieutenant Parker, a man barely 30, with a chest full of fresh medals, risked a step forward. "Sir," he said carefully, his voice measured, "the command is not recognized by the current manual." "Perhaps—" "Enough," Whitaker cut him off sharply. His voice was low, dangerous, like a blade dragged across stone. Parker immediately stiffened, retreating into silence. The general pivoted on his heel, eyes burning. "This is the United States Army," he declared, his voice booming. "And when an order is given, it is to be followed without hesitation. If you do not recognize it, you find a way to act. You respond." Yet the soldiers remained locked in their stances, unsure whether to improvise or risk dishonor. For the first time in years, Whitaker's iron authority met the unyielding wall of confusion. The parade ground seemed to shrink, the silence almost suffocating. Whitaker's mind flickered with memories. He had first learned the Riggs formation as a young cadet decades ago, under the watch of Drill Sergeant Riggs himself, a man whose methods were as brutal as they were effective. The formation had been phased out long before these young soldiers were even born, dismissed as unnecessary in the modern era. But to Whitaker, it had symbolized unity, precision, and above all, obedience. Now, staring at his silent troops, he wondered if discipline had grown weaker. He barked the command a third time. "Riggs formation, now!" The words reverberated off the barracks walls, but the response was unchanged. Rows of soldiers stood paralyzed, trapped between fear of doing nothing and fear of doing the wrong thing. Their silence was a rebellion of ignorance, not defiance. Whitaker's boots struck the ground like gunshots as he paced before them. His silence afterward was worse than any shouting. His hands clasped behind his back, his eyes cold and calculating, he let the weight of disappointment hang heavy. He was not just testing them. He was measuring something deeper, something they didn't yet understand. At the edges of the parade ground, life carried on in small, unnoticed rhythms. A few civilians who worked on base watched from a distance, curious. Among them was Mrs. Elena Alvarez, the cleaning lady, her mop resting in a bucket of soapy water. She had been on this base longer than most of the officers. Gray hair tucked beneath a scarf, posture slightly stooped from years of labor, she looked no different from any janitor who swept halls and mopped floors. Yet her dark eyes studied the scene intently, narrowing at the sound of the command. She remembered it, not as a word, not as a mystery, but as muscle memory buried deep within her bones. Her heart quickened. Memories stirred of boots stomping on gravel, of young cadets trembling under her voice, of a younger version of herself, not in gray uniforms of cleaning, but in crisp fatigues, commanding respect. But no one noticed her then. To the soldiers, she was invisible, just the woman who polished the floors and scrubbed the latrines. Back on the field, tension gnawed deeper. Private Lewis, barely 18, whispered through clenched teeth, "What the hell does he want from us?" "Shut it," hissed Sergeant Miller beside him. "You want to get yourself court-martialed for talking in formation?" "But—" "Silence," Miller snapped under his breath. The general's sharp gaze turned their way, and both men snapped their jaws shut, staring straight ahead. Whitaker stopped pacing. He stood still, planted firmly in the middle of the formation, his silence heavier than his words. He let the discomfort grow, let the uncertainty crawl into their minds. The air grew hotter, heavier. Sweat rolled down. Backs, boots itched to move but stayed locked in place. "Do none of you understand?" The general asked finally, his voice low, almost disappointed. "Has discipline become so shallow?" No one answered. Minutes dragged on like hours. The soldiers' muscles ached from the stillness. Some secretly hoped for a reprieve, for the colonel to intervene, for anything to break the unbearable pause. But Whitaker gave them nothing, no explanation, no adjustment, just the command, hanging in the air like a riddle unsolved. Then, from the sidelines, the faint squeak of a mop bucket broke the silence. Mrs. Alvarez had stepped away from her post. Slowly, deliberately, she placed the mop against the wall, wiped her damp hands on her gray uniform, and walked toward the parade. Ground. The soldiers didn't dare turn their heads, but they noticed her in their periphery, a quiet, almost ghostly figure. Whitaker noticed too. For the first time that morning, his eyes softened, not with pity, but with recognition. Alvarez reached the edge of the formation. Her back straightened, her chin lifted. She stood taller than most remembered seeing her. Decades seemed to fall away in that single step. Then, in one fluid motion, she snapped into the Riggs formation. Her heels clicked together, arms locked behind her back, shoulders pulled tight, chest raised, chin pointed like a blade. It was precise. It was flawless. It was unmistakably military. Gasps rippled through the ranks. Soldiers' eyes widened in shock. This wasn't a janitor fumbling with some guess. This was perfection. the kind only years of service could etch into a body. Whitaker's lips curved into the faintest smile. The silence broke, not with orders, not with corrections, but with revelation. The cleaning lady had answered the command, and she had done so better than any soldier standing in that formation. The parade ground remained frozen in time. The morning sun crept higher, painting the soldiers' helmets with an almost blinding sheen, yet no one blinked. Their eyes were forward, their bodies locked, their minds racing. For soldiers trained to respond instantly to orders, the paralysis was unbearable. Mrs. Alvarez's flawless execution of the mysterious formation had stunned them. She stood at rigid attention, body coiled with the precision of a soldier decades younger, her every line sharper than the bayonets fixed in their rifles. Around her, the company struggled silently to reconcile what they had just seen. The cleaning lady obeyed a command none of them understood, but Whitaker gave no explanation. He simply let the silence stretch, his boots rooted firmly as he studied his troops. The faintest hint of a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth, then disappeared as quickly as it came. His eyes swept across the rows of soldiers, daring one of them to move, to imitate, to guess, yet none dared risk it. Lieutenant Parker, still smarting from the general's earlier rebuke, clenched his fists at his sides. His thoughts churned. What is this? A humiliation exercise? A trap? He had excelled in every aspect of training, memorized every manual, drilled every maneuver until it carved grooves in his muscles. Yet here he stood, powerless, watching a janitor succeed where he failed. Colonel Sanders, too, was baffled. His brow furrowed beneath his cap, and for a fleeting moment he considered intervening. But he knew Whitaker well enough. The general wasn't careless. Every move was deliberate. If Sanders stepped in, it would look like weakness. So he remained, silent, lips pressed in a thin line. The younger privates fidgeted internally, though their bodies remained statues. Private Lewis fought to keep his knees from trembling. The sweat sliding down his back itched terribly, but he dared not scratch. He glanced sideways, just barely at Sergeant Miller. The veteran NCO's face was unreadable, but his jaw flexed with restrained frustration. Lewis's heart hammered. If even Miller doesn't know, we're doomed. A murmur began, faint as the rustling of leaves. It wasn't spoken aloud. No one was foolish enough to break silence, but in the language of darting eyes and clenched jaws, whispers passed between the soldiers. Is it a trick? Some kind of test? She knew it how? What does this mean for us? The ripple of confusion spread until it seemed the entire company vibrated with suppressed questions. Still, Whitaker remained impassive. He let their uncertainty build like storm clouds. Finally, his voice cracked through, the air like a rifle shot. Why do you hesitate? No one moved. Why do you falter? He pressed, his gaze like a blade slicing through the ranks. The soldiers stood rigid, their discipline the only thing holding them together. You stand here, proud of your training, proud of your strength, Whitaker continued, his voice growing colder. But training is nothing if you cannot adapt. Strength is nothing if you cannot obey. You wait for permission, for instructions, for manuals to guide you. Is this what the army has become? The accusation struck deeper than any reprimand. Soldiers who had endured grueling drills, sleepless nights, and punishing marches felt their pride fracture. To be called unadaptable, weak-cut, sharper than steel, Mrs. Alvarez remained motionless at attention, a silent rebuke to them all. Her presence unnerved the soldiers more than the general's scolding. Every man and woman on that field had seen her daily, pushing her mop bucket, humming softly as she cleaned, invisible as the walls she scrubbed. None had ever asked about her past. None had considered she might carry stories of her own. And yet here she was, embodying discipline more perfectly than the rest combined. Private Lewis felt shame claw at his chest. How is it possible? She's just the cleaning lady. But was she? Lieutenant Parker couldn't restrain himself this time. Taking a breath, he stepped forward and saluted sharply. Permission to speak, sir. Whitaker's eyes narrowed. A long pause stretched before he gave a single nod. Speak. Sir? Parker began, his voice steady, though his throat was dry. With respect, your command is not recognized by the modern manual. None of us have been trained in this maneuver. Without context, Whitaker cut him off with a glare. Are you telling me my soldiers cannot follow an order unless it is written in a book? Parker faltered. No, sir. I'm saying... His voice weakened, the weight of the general's stare crushing him. I'm saying we don't know how to respond. And yet, Whitaker's voice sliced through the still air. She does. He gestured sharply to Mrs. Alvarez, every head tilted, eyes darting toward her. Alvarez didn't flinch. She remained locked in formation, her chin high, her body carved in steel. The message was clear. Ignorance was no excuse. The order had meaning. Someone still remembered it. A murmur of shame spread through the troops. Sergeant Miller's mind raced. He had devoted 20 years to the service, endured deployments across the world, trained countless recruits. But never had he felt so exposed, so ignorant. That a civilian woman someone dismissed daily as just the janitor had answered the call while he stood paralyzed, burned inside him like fire. He wanted to move, to try, to do something. But fear held him back. What if he got it wrong? What if he made a fool of himself before the general, before his men? And so he remained silent, like the rest. Whitaker resumed pacing. His boots struck. The concrete in deliberate rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Each step echoed their failure. You think knowledge makes you soldiers, he said, his voice low, almost bitter. You think strength makes you invincible. But in war, you will hear commands. You do not expect. Orders will come in chaos, in languages you do not know, in codes half forgotten. And in that moment, will you freeze as you did now? His voice rose. Will you wait for manuals, for permission, while your comrades die? Or will you act? The words struck like blows. Chests tightened, faces burned. Mrs. Alvarez finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, she shifted out of the rig's formation. Her hands relaxed at her sides, her body returning to the stance of a civilian. She glanced, briefly, at Whitaker. The faintest understanding passed between them, silent recognition of old battles fought, of lessons too easily forgotten. Then she stepped back, retrieving her mop. But to the soldiers, her departure felt heavier than her presence. It was as though a ghost had walked among them, revealing a truth they had long ignored. The ranks remained stiff, but inside, questions roared louder than cannon fire. Who is she? How did she know that? Why does the general trust her more than us? The company commanders, too, were unsettled. They prided themselves on knowing every detail of their units. Yet none had ever thought to ask about the quiet woman who cleaned their offices. She had blended into the background so well they had all forgotten she was human, with history and memory of her own. Now, she was impossible to ignore. Whitaker stopped at the front of the formation. He clasped his hands behind his back and raised his chin. Remember this day? He said firmly. Remember what you felt: confusion, hesitation, shame. His eyes burned into theirs. You thought yourselves soldiers, but today you were statues. And the one who remembered discipline was not you. It was the one you overlooked. Silence. The weight of his words pressed on them heavier than their gear. Then, almost as if mocking them, Whitaker gave the command again. Rig's formation. The soldiers flinched. No one moved. Their shame deepened. The general's silence afterward was devastating. Colonel Sanders cleared his throat, breaking the tension at last. Company stand at ease. The soldiers obeyed instantly, shifting into a looser stance. Relief rippled quietly through them, though it was tainted with humiliation. Whitaker turned his gaze toward the flag, its stars and stripes fluttering against the clear sky. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he dismissed them with a curt nod. Drill is over. Gasps of surprise echoed silently in their hearts. The drill had barely begun, yet already it was over. The soldiers broke formation reluctantly, their boots scraping as they dispersed. But the weight of the morning followed them. No one spoke. Aloud, but in their minds, the same thought haunted them all. What just happened? And for the first time in years, the cleaning lady was the center of every soldier's attention. The soldiers filed back to their barracks like shadows, their boots heavy, their silence heavier. Morning drills usually ended with sweat-soaked bodies, bellowed corrections, and the comforting rhythm of practiced routine. Today, there was only the sting of failure. No one spoke openly, but the weight of the general's words clung to their thoughts like fog. Private Lewis walked beside Sergeant Miller, his shoulders slumped. He wanted to ask questions desperately, but his throat locked. Eventually, he whispered, "Sergeant, what just happened out there?" Miller's jaw clenched. "What happened," he muttered, "is we all got shown up. By a woman half these officers wouldn't salute if she carried stars on her shoulders." Lewis frowned. "But how?" "She's just—" "Don't say it," Miller cut him off sharply. His voice was harsh, but not angry, protective, almost. "She's not just anything. You saw it. That wasn't luck. That was training. Real training." Lewis swallowed, nodding. The shame burned hotter now. Across the base, whispers grew. Soldiers in the mess hall leaned close, voices low, trading theories like black market goods. "She used to be in the army, right? No way she just knew that by chance. My uncle served back in the 80s. He said Riggs formation was old school. Maybe she's, I don't know, retired?" "Retired? Then why's she scrubbing floors here? Maybe she got demoted. Maybe she screwed up. Or maybe she's a spy," one private whispered, earning a round of glares. The speculation spread like wildfire. For the first time, Alvarez's name was on every tongue. But Alvarez herself remained silent. She went about her duties as though nothing unusual had happened, mopping the hallways, wiping the windows, sweeping dust from the corners. Yet those who passed her couldn't help but notice something new. Her back was straighter, her steps sharper, and her eyes, dark, steady, unbothered, seemed to watch everything. That afternoon, Lieutenant Parker sat alone in his office, staring at his desk. His pride had taken a brutal hit. He prided himself on being a rising officer, a man destined for command. But today, he had stood useless in front of his general, outshone by a civilian janitor. He replayed the scene in his mind. Whitaker's voice, sharp as a blade. "And yet, she does." Parker clenched his fists. How could a woman with no rank humiliate them all? He stood abruptly, slamming his hands on the desk. No, this wasn't right. If Alvarez had military knowledge, then why wasn't it on record? Why wasn't he, an officer, informed? There was something hidden here, something. The general knew, something Alvarez carried like a secret badge. And Parker would find it. Meanwhile, in the general's quarters, Whitaker sat alone at his desk, staring at an old weathered book. Its leather cover was cracked, its pages yellow with age. Stamped on the front were the faded words, "Field Drills and Maneuvers, 1971. He turned to the chapter marked by a folded slip of paper, Riggs Formation. The diagrams leapt back to life in his memory, soldiers locking into tight unity. A maneuver built for endurance and cohesion, not speed. It had been Sergeant Riggs's masterpiece, a relic of a different army. Whitaker had never forgotten it. And clearly, neither had Alvarez. He rubbed his temples. The army had moved on, discarding what it deemed obsolete. But discipline never changed. He had wanted to see whether today's soldiers, born into manuals and simulations, could grasp the essence of obedience without instruction. They had failed. And Alvarez, humble, invisible Alvarez, had succeeded. Whitaker closed the book with a sigh. Perhaps tomorrow, the lesson would grow sharper. The next morning, tension buzzed through the base like static before a storm. The soldiers lined up again, their formation crisp, but their nerves raw. The memory of failure loomed over them. Colonel Sanders called them to attention. Whitaker emerged, his face unreadable, his stride firm. He stopped in front of them, his silence suffocating. The soldiers braced themselves. Then the order came. Again, Riggs' formation. A ripple of dread shot through the company. No one moved. Muscles tightened. Eyes darted. And then hesitation broke. Sergeant Miller, jaw set, stepped out of line. His boots struck the ground with determination. He snapped into a stance that vaguely resembled Alvarez's, though imperfect. His shoulders were tense, his elbows awkward, but his intent was clear. Gasps echoed down the ranks. Private Lewis, emboldened, followed. He mimicked Alvarez's form as best he could, feet clicking together. Others hesitated, then trickled into motion, copying each other, guessing, fumbling toward some semblance of unity. The result was chaos and uneven patchwork of stiff postures and crooked lines, but it was something. Whitaker's eyes narrowed. He let them hold the form for several painful seconds before barking, "At ease." The soldiers dropped back, relief and embarrassment mingling in their faces. "Better," Whitaker said flatly, "but not good enough." His gaze swept the ranks. Discipline is not imitation. It is knowledge. It is precision. Until you understand, you will fail again. His voice dropped lower, almost like a threat. And you will understand. That night, the base was restless. In the barracks, soldiers whispered long after lights out, their voices raw with frustration. "This is impossible. We're supposed to learn something that isn't even taught anymore. Maybe he's setting us up." "No, he's teaching us." Private Lewis lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed Alvarez's movements, the sharp heels, the rigid arms, the perfect stance. How had she done it so effortlessly? Finally, he whispered to Miller, who lay on the bunk above, "Sergeant, do you think she'd teach us?" Miller was silent for a long time. Then, in a low growl, he said, "Maybe, but you'd better be ready to swallow your pride, kid." Lewis nodded in the dark, though Miller couldn't see. Pride was already gone. The following day, Parker cornered Alvarez in the mess hall. She was wiping down tables when his shadow fell over her. "Mrs. Alvarez," he said stiffly. She glanced up, eyebrow raised. "Lieutenant." "I want to know," Parker said, keeping his tone sharp, "where you learned that formation." Alvarez smirked faintly. "Same place you learned yours." "In uniform." "That's not an answer," Parker snapped. "If you were military, I'd have a record. There isn't one." "Not in the files you've seen," Alvarez replied calmly, turning back to her work. Parker's fists tightened. "You humiliated my company. Do you understand that?" Alvarez paused, leaning on her rag. She looked him straight in the eye, her voice quiet but firm. "No, Lieutenant. You humiliated yourselves. I just reminded you what discipline looks like." Parker froze. For a moment, anger surged hot through him, but beneath it, shame coiled deeper. He turned on his heel and left, her words echoing in his ears. At the week's end, the tension had grown unbearable. Every morning, Whitaker issued the same command. Every morning, the soldiers stumbled closer, piecing fragments together, but never achieving the flawless unity Alvarez had shown. Their frustration turned into obsession. In secret corners of the barracks, groups began practicing, copying what they remembered of Alvarez's stance. Some mocked it at first, laughing through the awkward attempts. But slowly, the laughter died. Slowly, the precision grew. And slowly, respect for the quiet woman in gray uniforms deepened. Meanwhile, Whitaker watched everything in silence. He saw the soldiers' restless attempts, the whispered practices after drills. He saw Parker's stiff pride, Miller's determination, Lewis's quiet curiosity. He saw, too, how Alvarez carried herself differently, now how her presence longer blended into the background, but loomed like a silent challenge. The base was changing. And Whitaker knew the true lesson had only just begun. The parade ground stretched before them like an endless sheet of gray. The flag above rippled lazily in the faint morning breeze, but everything below it was frozen, locked in a silence so thick it pressed on the soldiers' lungs. General Whitaker had spoken his mysterious order again, and again they had failed him. No correction, no guidance, no explanation. Just his silence, heavier, sharper, more suffocating than any shouted rebuke. The soldiers stood rigid, staring forward, though. Their thoughts churned violently. For disciplined men and women who lived by routine, this uncertainty was unbearable. They had always known exactly what to do, exactly when to do it. Now, stripped of instruction, they were children lost in the dark. Private Lewis felt sweat trickle down his back, his uniform sticking uncomfortably to his skin. His arms ached from holding position, but he dared not shift. The silence clawed at him, worse than the sting of muscles. Say something, do something. His mind screamed, but his mouth stayed locked. Above him, Sergeant Miller's face was carved from stone, but Lewis could see the twitch of his jaw, the way his nostrils flared with each controlled breath. Miller was furious, not at Whitaker, not even at Alvarez, but at himself. He had trained for decades, endured battlefields and drills, but here he was, paralyzed like a raw recruit. He had stepped forward once, tried to imitate Alvarez's stance, only to be dismissed as better, but not good enough. That shame still burned hot in his chest. Lieutenant Parker, standing with the other officers, clenched his fists behind his back. His pride, already fractured, now felt ground into dust. He had studied every manual, memorized every regulation, spent years sharpening himself into the image of an officer the Army could trust, yet none of it mattered here. None of it answered Whitaker's riddle. And Alvarez, the janitor, the nobody, still loomed in his thoughts. Why her? Why not me? The silence dragged on, the general pacing slowly before them, his boots clicking with deliberate rhythm. Each step echoed like judgment. He did not need to shout. His stillness was punishment enough. At the far edge of the field, Alvarez resumed her work. She had stepped forward once, shown them the formation perfectly, then returned to her mop and bucket as though nothing had happened. Yet she was not invisible anymore. Every soldier on that ground was aware of her presence, her small frame moving methodically, the sound of her mop sliding faintly across the tiles near the barracks wall. She didn't look at them, not openly, but her awareness was clear. Her back was straighter now, her steps measured, as though she carried some invisible rank they could no longer deny. And it unnerved them more than the general silence. The pause stretched. 10 minutes. 15. Time blurred into a painful eternity. No one dared move, no one dared speak. Even the bravest sergeants, Men and women who had stared down the barrel of rifles in war zones now stood as though chained by their own uncertainty. Finally, Whitaker stopped pacing. He stood squarely before them, hands clasped behind his back, eyes like flint. "None of you will move until you understand," he said softly, his voice low but carrying across the yard. The words were worse than a shout. They were a sentence. A murmur of panic flickered in the soldiers' minds. Until. We understand? Did he mean minutes? Hours? Days? They could not last forever in this heat, in this stance, without food or water. But the general did not look like a man who would relent. Colonel Sanders, standing stiff beside him, risked a glance. His instincts urged him to intervene, to release the soldiers before exhaustion overtook them. But he knew Whitaker too well. The general was deliberate in everything. If Sanders interrupted, it would dishonor him in front of the troops. So he stayed silent, though his gut churned. Private Lewis's legs began to tremble. He clenched his muscles desperately, praying. No one would see. He thought of Alvarez's flawless posture, so calm, so effortless. How had she held it for so long? Beside him, another private swayed faintly, catching themselves before stumbling. A ripple of unease spread through the ranks. Whitaker noticed. Of course, he noticed. His gaze pinned the soldier like a hawk spotting prey. But he said nothing. The silence deepened again. In that silence, shame grew heavier than fatigue. Each soldier battled not only the heat and the strain, but the gnawing voice in their mind that whispered, "You failed. You froze. You hesitated." For many, this was worse than any punishment Whitaker could have devised. Then, without warning, Alvarez stopped mopping. She set her bucket aside, straightened her back, and once again stepped toward the edge of the formation. Every eye flicked toward her. They dared not move their heads, but they felt her presence like a shift in the air. Whitaker's eyes followed her calmly, expectantly. Alvarez did not speak. She did not explain. She simply snapped once more into Riggs formation. Crisp, perfect, exact. A silence shattered into awe. For a moment, the soldiers almost hated her. She was showing them up again, exposing their ignorance. But deeper than that anger was something else. Respect. They wanted to know. They needed to know. Private Lewis bit his lip. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to follow, to imitate, to risk being wrong. His pride warred with his desperation. Finally, he shifted. Just slightly. His heels clicked together, his arms locked behind his back. The movement was clumsy, imperfect, but it was movement. Sergeant Miller noticed. His jaw tightened, but then, slowly, he mirrored the stance. His body adjusted, correcting what Lewis had fumbled. And then another soldier joined. And another. Within moments, ripples spread through the formation as soldiers tentatively tried to align themselves with Alvarez. It was messy, lines crooked, shoulders uneven. But it was unity, however fragile. Whitaker's face remained unreadable. The general let them hold it for a long, agonizing minute. Then finally he barked, "At ease." Relief flooded the soldiers. Bodies as they loosened their stances, breaths rushing from their lungs. Some nearly collapsed, but steadied themselves quickly. Whitaker stepped forward. His voice was calm, almost quiet, but every word carried weight. "Better," he said, "but not enough." The disappointment was worse than anger. You moved. Only when another showed you the way. That is not leadership. That is not discipline. That is dependence. His gaze swept the ranks, cutting through each man and woman. Discipline is not imitation, he said. It is knowledge. Precision. Certainty. Until you hold that in your bones, you will fail again. His silence afterward was crushing. That evening, the base was restless. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones, voices heavy with frustration and shame. Some cursed Alvarez under their breath. Others defended her. But none could deny the truth. She had shown them what they lacked. In the barracks, Lewis whispered to Miller, "Sergeant, if she knows it, maybe she could teach us." Miller didn't answer at first. His eyes stared into the dark, his mind heavy. Finally, he muttered, "Maybe, but you better be ready to ask." Lewis nodded, though fear coiled in his stomach. Asking the cleaning lady for help felt strange, humiliating. But wasn't that better than failing again? Elsewhere, Lieutenant Parker sat alone in his quarters, seething. Alvarez's words in the mess hall still echoed in his head. "You humiliated yourselves. I just reminded you what discipline looks like." He couldn't let it go. He needed to uncover her past, her records, her truth. How had the general allowed a civilian to hold more authority, more knowledge than him? Parker's pride burned hotter than his curiosity. He would find answers, no matter what it took. And in his office, Whitaker closed the old manual again. His plan was working. The silence, the pause, the shame, they were all chisels breaking down his soldier's arrogance. But this was only the beginning. The tension on the parade ground had reached a breaking point. Even after the general's biting words, the soldiers felt lost, their pride bruised beyond repair. They were used to clear orders, not riddles. They were used to winning drills, not failing in silence. The air smelled of sweat, dust, and humiliation. And then it happened. From the far edge of the yard, a quiet sound broke through, the soft squeak of a mop bucket rolling to a stop. Mrs. Alvarez, the gray-haired cleaning lady, straightened her back. She let the mop rest against the wall. Then, as though guided by instinct, she stepped onto the open concrete where all eyes could see her. At first, the soldiers hardly believed what they were seeing. What business did she have standing there? She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't part of their drill. She was the woman who wiped down the mess hall tables, who hummed old Spanish tunes, while polishing the brass railings in the barracks. And yet, her posture silenced the field more completely than any command Whitaker had ever barked. Alvarez moved with calm assurance, her small frame steady, her chin lifted. The lines on her face caught the sunlight, making her look both weary and timeless. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her heels clicked sharply as she planted them together, the sound echoing across the concrete. Then, with a crispness that startled even the veterans, she snapped into Riggs formation. It was flawless. Her shoulders squared with invisible precision. Her arms folded exactly behind her back, fingers interlaced in the ancient style the younger soldiers had never been taught. Her stance radiated authority, not borrowed, not imitated, but lived. Gasps rippled down the ranks. Private Lewis's mouth went dry. He had tried and failed to mirror this stance earlier, yet here she was, executing it with the elegance of a seasoned drill instructor. Sergeant Miller's eyes narrowed, recognition stirring in the back of his mind. He had seen that stance once before, years ago, buried in an old manual, dismissed as outdated. But here it was, alive and sharp before him. Lieutenant Parker's fists clenched. His pride screamed at him to deny it, to claim it was coincidence. But there was no denying the perfection of her form. General Whitaker stood at ease, watching her. For the first time that day, a flicker of softness passed across his stern features, the faintest shadow of a smile tugging at his lips. "Outstanding," he said quietly. It wasn't addressed to the soldiers. It was for her. And that alone shattered the last of their pride. Alvarez held the stance without tremor, without hesitation. She did not look at the troops, nor at Whitaker, but into the distance, as though seeing a past only she remembered. Her silence was its own kind of authority. The soldiers shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, they weren't just humiliated, they were humbled. The realization cut deep. A woman they had overlooked daily, dismissed as ordinary, carried within her a discipline they hadn't yet grasped. Private Lewis's heart pounded. Shame stung him, but so did admiration. He whispered under his breath, barely audible, How does she know? Sergeant Miller heard him. He didn't answer, but in his gut he already knew. Alvarez wasn't just a cleaning lady. She never had been. The ripple of unease turned into whispers that buzzed at the edge of discipline. Soldiers glanced sideways, eyes darting toward Alvarez. The younger recruits looked confused, the older ones uneasy. Even the officers shifted, their rigid composure fraying. Parker, unable to stay silent, finally stepped forward. "General," he said, voice tight. "Permission to speak freely?" Whitaker didn't look at him. "Denied." Parker's jaw clenched. His pride was boiling over, but he swallowed it back. His eyes burned with resentment as they fixed on Alvarez. The general finally spoke. To the troops, his voice steady but hard. "You see her," he said, gesturing slightly toward Alvarez. "You see what you cannot yet do. You see what you have forgotten. This command, this stance is not new. It is older than most of you. It is discipline in its purest form. And she," he nodded toward Alvarez, "remembers." A wave of murmurs moved through the ranks. Alvarez did not flinch. She remained. Steady, shoulders locked, eyes forward. She didn't need to defend herself. Her posture spoke louder than any words. Private Lewis felt a strange fire stirring in his chest. For the first time since the humiliation began, hope crept into him. If she could do it, maybe they could too. But it wasn't just about learning a stance anymore. It was about proving themselves worthy of it. Sergeant Miller's pride warred with his logic. He wanted to scoff, to cling to his authority. But deep down, he respected what he saw. A memory surfaced of his own drill sergeant years ago, hammering into him that true discipline wasn't about power, but about respect for the craft. Miller clenched his jaw, knowing Alvarez embodied that truth. The general turned sharply to face his soldiers. "You think discipline comes from rank," he said, "from stripes on your sleeve or bars on your shoulder. You think it comes from obeying orders you understand. But discipline," he paused, letting the silence weigh heavy again, "comes when you obey what you do not yet understand. When you trust the structure so deeply, you become it." His words sank like stones into their hearts. "Today," Whitaker continued, "you were shown your weakness. You froze. You hesitated. And only one among you remembered the old ways. That should tell you everything you need to know." He let the silence stretch. No one dared move. Finally, Whitaker looked back at Alvarez. "Dismissed," he said softly. She released the stance with quiet grace, turned, and walked back to her mop and bucket. Not a word, not a glance. Just calm footsteps fading into the background, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And that, more than anything, unsettled them all. That night, the base was buzzing. In the mess hall, soldiers whispered fiercely over their meals. Some were defensive. "She just got lucky," one muttered. Anyone could have done that if they knew the stance. Others disagreed. "No," another said. "That wasn't luck. That was training. Real training." Private Lewis sat silently at the table, replaying the moment in his head. He wanted to approach Alvarez, to ask her how she knew. But fear held him back. She had already embarrassed them once. What if she laughed at him? Sergeant Miller noticed his hesitation. "If you want to learn, Lewis," he said gruffly, "you'll have to swallow your pride. That's the first lesson." Lewis nodded, but the weight of it sat heavy in his chest. Meanwhile, in the officers' quarters, Lieutenant Parker paced furiously. His pride was bleeding out of him. Alvarez had humiliated him in front of his men, and Whitaker had let it happen. She's just a cleaning lady, Parker told himself again. And again. She's nobody. How could she know something I don't? But the question gnawed at him. He couldn't rest until he uncovered her past. He vowed silently. He would dig into her records, her history. Whatever it took, he would expose her truth. And alone in his office, General Whitaker sat at his desk, hands resting on a weathered manual. He stared at its pages, tracing the faded ink with his fingers. He knew what came next. The lesson had only begun. But the spark was there now, the spark of doubt, of curiosity, of humility. And that spark, if nurtured, could burn away arrogance and forge something stronger. He closed the book gently, his mind already turning to the next test. The soldiers, though, could think only of her. Mrs. Alvarez, the cleaning lady, the nobody. And yet, in that single moment on the parade ground, she had stood taller than all of them. The silence that had once suffocated the parade ground now felt different. It was no longer the silence of confusion, but of awe. When Mrs. Alvarez clicked her heels together and executed the command with perfect form, she shattered the illusion. The soldiers had built around her. She was no longer invisible. The general's approving nod had sealed the moment in history. Every soldier, from the newest recruit to the oldest sergeant, stood witness to a truth they hadn't expected. A woman they'd overlooked for years had shown them what they could not do. At first, no one moved. The air felt thick, alive with disbelief. Private Lewis's eyes followed every motion Alvarez made. The sharpness of her stance, the strength behind it, even the quiet pride in her expression. It was all burned into his memory. He had tried, failed, and doubted himself. But she had done it without hesitation, like it was second nature. He whispered, almost reverently. She knew it. She really knew it. Sergeant Miller heard him and gave the faintest grunt. She didn't just know it, she owned it. Lieutenant Parker, however, looked like a storm cloud ready to burst. His jaw was set tight, his nostrils flared. He couldn't accept what he'd seen. A woman who mopped floors had outshone him in front of the general, in front of his men. His pride, carefully built on rank and control, was cracking. She's nobody, he muttered under his breath, though he didn't believe it anymore. She doesn't belong here. But deep down, jealousy gnawed at him. General Whitaker broke the silence at last. His voice was calm, but carried a weight that pressed on every man's shoulders. You see her? He asked, gesturing toward Alvarez. This is discipline. This is memory. This is history alive in flesh and bone. She has shown you what I expected, and what you failed to give. He let the words settle like heavy stones. Do not think this was luck, he continued. Do not think it was a trick. This command is older than you, older than your training. Manuals. It is the foundation upon which soldiers like me were built. And yet none of you recognized it, except her. Every soldier shifted uneasily. Pride was draining from them like water through a sieve. Alvarez didn't speak. She didn't need to. She stood firm in the stance, the embodiment of discipline. Itself, her silence was louder than a speech. Her body told the story of years they hadn't lived, of lessons they hadn't learned. Private Lewis stared at her like a student staring at a teacher for the first time. I want to know, he thought. I have to know. Whitaker let his gaze sweep across the ranks. His eyes hardened, though the faint shadow of satisfaction still lingered at the corners. You all think rank makes you soldiers. But rank, without discipline, is nothing. Knowledge without memory is wasted. That is why you failed today. And that is why she succeeded. The sting of his words struck deep. Even Parker, who wanted to object, couldn't muster the courage. Finally, Whitaker turned back to Alvarez. His voice softened slightly. At ease. She relaxed her stance, her body moving with the fluidity of long habit. Then she simply walked back toward her mop and bucket, her face calm, her eyes unreadable. No grand gestures, no boastful smile. She slipped back into the role they all thought she'd never left. The soldiers watched her go, their pride crushed under the weight of her quiet authority. That evening, the base was restless. In the barracks, whispers filled the bunks. Some soldiers were defensive, clinging to their pride. She just remembered some old trick, one muttered. The general probably told her in advance. Another shook his head. No way. Did you see her stance? That wasn't a trick. That was real training. Private Lewis sat quietly, his thoughts tangled. He wanted to ask her. He wanted to know how she had learned it, why she had remembered, what it meant. But something held him back, a mixture of respect and fear. Tomorrow, he whispered to himself. Tomorrow, I'll ask. In the NCO quarters, Sergeant Miller sat with his men. His voice was low but steady. I've been in this army a long time, he sighed. And I've seen plenty of people try to fake discipline. But that woman today, that wasn't fake. That was the real thing. You don't just stumble into form like that. You live it. You bleed it. The younger sergeants nodded reluctantly. None of them wanted to admit they had been humbled by a cleaning lady, but the truth was undeniable. Meanwhile, in the officers' quarters, Parker seethed. He slammed his glass down on the table, the liquid splashing over his papers. She humiliated me. She humiliated us, and Whitaker let her. Captain Reynolds, older and steadier, looked at him with calm disapproval. It wasn't humiliation, Parker. It was a lesson. You're too proud to see it, Parker sneered. A lesson from a janitor? Don't make me laugh, but his voice cracked as he said it. The bitterness in his tone revealed the truth. He was afraid. Afraid that the foundation of his authority had been shaken. Afraid that the soldiers he commanded now respected her more than him. Later that night, Parker sat at his desk, papers spread before him. He pulled up base personnel records, scrolling through names until he found hers, Maria Alvarez. Her file was thin, unremarkable. Hired as a civilian contractor, no military service listed. On paper, she was exactly who she appeared to be, a cleaning lady. But Parker didn't believe it. He stared at the file, jaw tightening. Something's missing. Something they don't want us to see. He made a silent vow. He would uncover her history. He would prove she was just an old woman with a lucky memory. And if he couldn't, he would make sure no one else uncovered the truth either. In contrast, General Whitaker sat alone in his office, an old manual open before him. His finger traced the faded text of commands, long abandoned by modern training. Riggs Formation. Page 47. He remembered his own youth, when he had been broken down and rebuilt, under the weight of such commands. He remembered Alvarez then, her voice sharp, her eyes unyielding, the woman who had once drilled him until his bones ached. A faint smile crossed his lips. They don't know who you are, he whispered to the empty room. Not yet. He closed the book gently, already planning the next test. The next morning, the soldiers gathered again on the parade ground. But something was different. They weren't just standing in ranks. They were waiting for her. Private Lewis's heart pounded as he saw Alvarez moving along the edge of the field, mop in hand, just as she always did. But now, every soldier's eyes followed her. She noticed, of course. She always noticed, but she gave no sign of recognition. She simply pushed her bucket, humming softly, as though yesterday hadn't happened at all. General Whitaker stepped forward, his presence commanding silence. "Yesterday," he said, "you were shown your weakness. Today, you will begin to correct it." A ripple of unease passed through the ranks. Whitaker's voice hardened. "You will learn. And your teacher," he turned his head slightly, his eyes locking on Alvarez, "is already here." They... Soldiers froze. Alvarez stopped in her tracks, her hands resting lightly on the mop handle. She tilted her head, the faintest glimmer of surprise flickering in her eyes. But then she straightened, her expression calm, unreadable. Whitaker gave a single nod. And just like that, the soldiers realized the cleaning lady was about to become their instructor. The morning air was sharp with the crisp bite of discipline. The soldiers stood in formation once again, but their focus wasn't on General Whitaker this time. Their eyes, almost against their will, drifted toward Mrs. Alvarez, who lingered near her mop and bucket at the edge of the field. She seemed unchanged. Her uniform of work clothes hung loosely from her shoulders. Her gray hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her hands bore the calluses of labor. She was ordinary, painfully ordinary. And yet none of them could forget the way she had moved the day before. It gnawed at them like an itch under the skin. General Whitaker's voice cut through the morning. "You wonder why she succeeded where you failed." His words dropped like stones, each syllable heavy. The soldiers stiffened. He was not asking. He was accusing. "You doubt her," he continued. "You doubt me. You think yesterday was a trick, or luck, or chance." His eyes swept the ranks, sharp and unyielding, but it was none of those things. It was memory. It was experience. It was knowledge you don't yet understand. Whitaker paused, then turned toward Alvarez, stepped forward. The soldiers' heads followed her as she placed the mop gently against the bucket. With quiet dignity, she walked onto the parade ground, each step steady, unhurried. She didn't seem embarrassed, nor proud. She simply moved like someone who belonged. Private Lewis felt his heart quicken. He had waited for this moment. He wanted answers, needed them. Who was she? Beside him, Sergeant Miller muttered under his breath. "I knew it. She's no ordinary cleaning lady." But Lieutenant Parker's jaw clenched tight. His resentment was a coiled spring, ready to snap. Whitaker stood beside Alvarez now. Before you ever knew her as the woman who cleaned your floors, she wore a uniform. She drilled soldiers. She broke them down and built them back up again. She stood where I stand now. Gasps rippled through the ranks. Some soldiers exchanged stunned glances. Others frowned, trying to reconcile the image of the quiet woman with a vision of her as a drill instructor. "She trained me," Whitaker said firmly, his voice carrying over the field. "She forged me into what I am. Every order you obey from me was first barked into my ears by her." The revelation hit them like thunder. Private Lewis whispered, "She trained him?" His voice cracked with disbelief. Corporal Jensen, standing nearby, shook his head slowly. "No way. She looks like somebody's grandmother." Sergeant Miller silenced them both with a glare. "Open your eyes. You saw it yesterday. You felt it. That wasn't luck. That was the hand of someone who's lived it." Parker couldn't stay silent. He stepped forward, his voice sharp, almost trembling with anger. "Sir, with respect, that's impossible. There's no record. I checked her file myself. She was never enlisted. She was never commissioned. She's..." "Enough." Whitaker's voice cracked like a whip. The silence that followed was suffocating. Parker froze, his face flushed. Whitaker turned his piercing gaze on him. "You think the truth is always written on paper? You think history is confined to what the system chooses to record? Some service, some sacrifice is erased, buried, forgotten. But those who lived it, they carry it still." Alvarez's eyes met Whitaker's for a moment. There was a flicker of something unspoken between them, a recognition, a shared past. Finally, Alvarez spoke. Her voice was low, steady, carrying an accent softened by time but unmistakable. "He's right about one thing," she said, glancing briefly at Parker. "There are no records, not anymore." The soldiers leaned forward, almost physically, straining to hear her. "I joined the army when I was younger than some of you standing here. They didn't want me, said women had no place. But I wouldn't take no for an answer. I fought for the right to stand in formation, to march, to train. And when they finally let me in, I had to work twice as hard to be seen as half as good." Her eyes hardened, her voice sharpened. "So I trained harder. I drilled harder. And when the time came, I was given men to shape. And I shaped them." The soldiers stared, stunned into silence. Whitaker's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "She shaped me," he repeated quietly, as if to anchor the truth into their minds. Alvarez continued, her gaze sweeping the ranks. "The command you heard yesterday wasn't just a command. It was a test. An old one, designed to break hesitation, to teach obedience without thought. You didn't know it, because they stopped teaching it years ago. But for me, it was burned into muscle and bone. I couldn't forget it if I tried." Her words struck deep. The soldiers shifted uncomfortably, each one replaying the scene in their minds, realizing the depth of their ignorance. Private Lewis felt awe flooding through him. To think she had carried such a history, unspoken, hidden behind a mop and bucket. He wanted to ask her everything, what it had been like, what she had seen, what she had lost. But his throat was tight. Parker, however, was trembling with fury. He felt the ground slipping out from under him. The respect of his men, the authority of his rank, all of it was being stolen by this woman. "She's lying," he spat suddenly. The words erupted before he could stop them. "It's a story." "Nothing more," the formation gasped. Whitaker's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Lieutenant Parker." But Alvarez raised a hand gently. "Let him speak. Doubt is natural. It was natural when I stood in front of soldiers for the first time, too." She turned her gaze on Parker, steady and unflinching. "You doubt me because you don't want to believe someone like me could do what you cannot. But deep down, you know the truth. You saw it yesterday." Parker's face reddened, his fists clenched, but he could not find an answer. Whitaker stepped forward, his voice firm and final. "This woman is not here to replace you. She is here to remind you, to remind us all that discipline is timeless, that respect is earned not by title, but by action." He looked over the formation. "From this day forward, you will not see her as a cleaning lady. You will see her as a keeper of your history. And you will learn from her, as I once did." The soldiers absorbed the words in silence. That night, the base buzzed with whispers again, but this time it wasn't disbelief. It was reverence. In the barracks, Private Lewis whispered to his bunkmate, "Can you believe it? All this time, she was here. And we never knew." Corporal Jensen shook his head. "Makes you wonder how many other stories are hidden right in front of us." Sergeant Miller's voice carried from the corner. "Don't wonder. Learn. Watch her. Every step, every movement. You'll never get another chance to learn from someone like her." Parker sat alone in his quarters, seething. The respect in the eyes of his men was slipping from him, sliding toward her. He stared at his reflection in the darkened window, his jaw tight, his eyes burning. "She won't take this from me," he whispered. "She can't." But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. She already had. The next day, Whitaker assembled the troops again. Alvarez stood beside him, no longer at the margins, but at the center. "This woman has more to teach you than I alone can give, Whitaker. said, "You will learn from her, and through her you will learn what it means to be soldiers worthy of your uniform." Alvarez stepped forward, her gaze steady, her voice sharp. "Fall in," she commanded, and without hesitation, every soldier obeyed. The soldiers stood in rigid formation beneath the hard morning light. The air was taut with something unfamiliar, not fear, not tension, but anticipation. Yesterday, their world had tilted. Today, they stood on the edge of something they didn't yet have words for. Mrs. Alvarez was no longer just the woman who pushed a mop down their barracks halls. She was something more, a living reminder that the uniform carried weight beyond fabric and metals, that knowledge did not die simply because someone left active service. General Whitaker, stern as always, stood at the head of the formation. Yet even he seemed changed. His shoulders were squared, his chin lifted, but there was a softness to his eyes as he looked toward Alvarez, standing beside him with quiet poise. "You all saw what happened," Whitaker began, his voice rolling like distant thunder across the parade ground. "You saw discipline revealed where you least expected it, and now you will learn from it. Today is not the end of that lesson. Today is only the beginning." The ranks stood motionless, every ear straining. Alvarez stepped forward, her hands clasped behind her back, her stance balanced, her eyes sharp despite her age. She looked like she belonged there, more so than half the young officers lined up before her. "When you wear this uniform," she said, her voice carrying, "with quiet strength, you carry more than fabric on your back. You carry the weight of history. Every command, every drill, every formation, it's not just routine, it's tradition. It's the voices of those who came before you, echoing through your steps. When you forget that, you dishonor them." The words struck the soldiers like a hammer. Private Lewis swallowed hard. He had always thought of drills as just drills, repetition. But now he realized they were pieces of a story written long before he was born. Parker stood near the front, his jaw tight, his eyes smoldering. He could feel the respect of the soldiers shifting like sand under his feet. Every word Alvarez spoke pulled them further from his orbit. And yet, even he couldn't deny the weight in her tone, the certainty that came from lived experience. Alvarez paced slowly before the ranks. "Some of you think strength comes from rank. That stripes and bars on your shoulders are what make you respected. You're wrong. Respect is earned when you show your men that you understand what they endure, that you've walked their path, that you're willing to bleed the same blood they bleed." Her gaze swept across the field, pinning every soldier in place. "When I trained recruits decades ago, I was tested every single day, not by my superiors, but by those I led. They wanted to know if I was worthy of their obedience. And I learned that worth is proven in silence, in sweat, in the smallest moments when no one else is watching." Whitaker stepped forward, his voice booming again. "She is right. You thought you failed yesterday because you didn't know the command. But your true failure was hesitation. You froze because you couldn't reconcile authority with uncertainty. A soldier must learn that obedience is not just about following words, it's about trust. And you didn't trust. Not me. Not yourselves." The words cut deep, but they were not cruel. They were sharpening stones, grinding away excuses. Alvarez lifted her chin. "But you will learn. Because now you have no choice." General Whitaker turned sharply. "Mrs. Alvarez will lead you through drills today. Obey her as you would obey me. Watch her. Learn from her." The soldiers' eyes widened. A murmur threatened to ripple through the ranks, but the general's glare smothered it before it began. Alvarez took a deep breath and barked her first command. The soldiers moved. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through hesitation. Commands flowed from her like water down stone, steady and unrelenting. And though her body was older, her presence filled the field with an authority that needed no amplification. Private Lewis found himself moving with a sharpness he hadn't felt in weeks. His limbs obeyed almost instinctively, as if Alvarez's voice had tapped into something deeper than muscle memory. Corporal Jensen's thoughts raced. This isn't just training. This is history moving through us. Even Sergeant Miller, hardened by years of service, felt humbled by the realization that he was standing in the shadow of someone who had already shaped generations before him. But Parker seethed. Each command Alvarez gave felt like a strike against his authority. Each crisp movement by the soldiers chipped away at his position. He clenched his fists so hard his knuckles went white. When Alvarez finally paused, Parker couldn't hold back any longer. "Sir," he barked toward Whitaker, "this is a mistake. We are soldiers of today, not relics of the past. We don't need forgotten commands and ghost stories to make us strong. We need discipline rooted in the present." Whitaker's eyes snapped to Tim. Silence fell instantly. Alvarez turned too, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the weight of the air pressed down on everyone. Then Alvarez spoke, her tone calm but piercing. "Discipline is not past or present, Lieutenant. Discipline is timeless. It is the thread that ties every soldier from the first to the last. Break that thread, and your army is nothing but men in uniforms." The words struck harder than any reprimand Whitaker could have given. Parker opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time, his certainty faltered. Whitaker's voice followed, steady and final. "If you cannot understand that, Parker, then you have no place leading men." The lieutenant's face drained of color. He stiffened, nodded sharply, and said nothing more. The drills continued. Hour after hour, Alvarez guided them, her commands weaving seamlessly between the past and present. What began as hesitation turned into rhythm, and rhythm into unity. By midday, the soldiers no longer thought about the oddness of obeying a cleaning lady. They no longer doubted her. They moved as one, sharper than they had in months. When Whitaker finally called a halt, the field buzzed with something new. Not fatigue, not frustration, but pride. Alvarez stood before them, her chest rising with controlled breaths. Her eyes softened for the first time. "You have begun to learn," she said quietly. "Not because of me, but because you opened yourselves to what was always here. Remember this. Strength is not in the uniform you wear. It is in the humility to learn from anyone, anywhere, at any time." The soldiers stood in silence, their respect unspoken but palpable. Whitaker nodded once. Dismissed. The ranks broke, but no one rushed off as they usually did. Instead, groups lingered, murmuring quietly, their eyes often drifting back to Alvarez. Private Lewis approached her hesitantly. "Mom, Mrs. Alvarez, I just wanted to say thank you." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, her hand rested gently on his shoulder. "Don't thank me, son. Thank the uniform you wear. It gives you the chance to be better every day." Lewis swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. That evening, as the sun dipped low, the barracks were alive with whispers. Soldiers spoke not of punishment or confusion, but of pride. "She trained the general himself," one said. "She moved like she never forgot a thing," another added. "She's more soldier than any of us," someone murmured. And though the words varied, the feeling was the same: reverence. In his quarters, Parker sat alone in the dark. His reflection in the mirror looked hollow, stripped of the confidence he once carried like armor. For the first time, doubt seeped into him, not of Alvarez, but of himself. The next morning, Whitaker stood before his men once more. Alvarez stood at his side. "You have learned something rare," he said, his voice steady. "That respect. and wisdom can come from where you least expect. That the people who seem invisible may carry the greatest truths. Carry that with you, because it will serve you longer than any weapon or command. He turned to Alvarez, giving her a small nod. Alvarez stepped forward, her eyes glistening faintly with emotion. She kept tightly controlled. I will not always be here, but the lesson will. Every time you stand at attention, remember that you are part of something larger than yourself. Remember that the past is not dead, it lives through you. The silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly, as if moved by an unseen force, the soldiers brought their boots together and stood at full attention. It was not for Whitaker. It was for her. From that day on, Mrs. Alvarez was never again seen as just the cleaning lady. The soldiers greeted her with respect, not out of obligation, but out of genuine reverence. Her quiet footsteps in the hall carried the weight of history, and every recruit who passed her whispered stories of the day. She had stood on the parade ground and reminded them all what it meant to be a soldier. The general's forgotten command became more than a drill. It became a story, passed down, etched into memory. And every time boots clicked together on that field, the soldiers remembered the morning when wisdom rose from the most unexpected place. They remembered the lesson. They remembered her.